The train to Milord rolled gently through the rolling hills, its wheels hissing against the tracks as it slowed toward the quaint countryside station. Miss Marple, nestled into the worn velvet seat by the window, watched the landscape shift from expansive green fields to small clusters of thatched cottages. The village below seemed frozen in time, shrouded in a stillness that hinted at secrets buried beneath its quiet exterior. She had arrived at the invitation of Mrs. Edith Weatherby, an old friend who, after years of sporadic letters, had urgently insisted that her presence was needed. Stepping off the train, Miss Marple was greeted with a warm but somewhat strained embrace by Edith, whose eyes seemed to dart about, betraying a hidden anxiety. Together they walked down the narrow cobbled streets, the village eerily silent, as if it too were holding its breath. Edith led her to a charming if slightly disordered home where tea was served promptly, the scent of freshly baked scones floating in the air. But even amidst the comfort, something was off. Edith's hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea, and her voice when she spoke was laced with an unspoken tension. "You've come at an interesting time, Jane," she said softly. Miss Marple, sensing there was more to this visit than met the eye, simply nodded, waiting for the truth to unfold. Edith leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Do you remember Estelle Carrington? She married Richard, the banker's son, a delicate girl, always a bit fragile. But recently, Jane, she's been saying the most peculiar thing. She claims she's seen her own death." Miss Marple arched an eyebrow, leaning in, intrigued yet wary. Edith's next words hung in the air, almost absurd yet delivered with the certainty of a prophecy. "She says it will happen in 3 days, that she knows the exact moment she will die." Miss Marple took a deliberate sip of her tea, eyeing her friend over the rim of her cup. There was something unnerving about Edith's demeanor. This was no idle gossip. The villagers had dismissed Estelle's claims as the ramblings of a fragile mind, but Edith's palpable unease told a different story. As the day turned to night, and a crisp chill swept through the village, Miss Marple found herself at the Carrington estate. The grand ivy-clad house stood at the edge of the village, the last rays of sunlight casting long shadows. Estelle Carrington was not what Miss Marple expected. There was no hysteria, no wild-eyed frenzy. Instead, Estelle sat before her, calm, yet weary, her eyes shadowed by an unsettling wisdom. "I have seen my death," she said, her voice steady, but tinged with a haunting certainty. "It will happen in 3 days." Miss Marple studied her closely, noting the way her hands gripped the arms of her chair, as though holding on to something, anything, that might save her. "You sound quite sure of it," Miss Marple remarked. Estelle offered a small, almost sad smile. "I wish I weren't," she replied quietly. Miss Marple leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. "How do you know this? How did you come to such a conclusion?" Estelle hesitated, but only for a moment. "It wasn't a dream, it wasn't a feeling. I saw it as clearly as I see you now. It was as if it had already happened. And the worst part, I know I can't stop it." She exhaled softly, a tremor of real fear in her voice. By the morning, Estelle's chilling prediction had rippled through the village, stirring whispers in every corner. But one question lingered in Miss Marple's mind. Was it a premonition, a trick of the mind, or was something far darker at play, waiting to unfold in the shadow of the Carrington legacy? The small village of Mellard had long been known for its tranquil charm, where nothing much ever seemed to disturb the rhythm of daily life. But that afternoon, whispers fluttered like the soft breeze that carried the scent of lavender from the garden, and the streets seemed unnaturally still. A quiet undercurrent of unease had settled over the village after Estelle Carrington's chilling prediction. The woman who claimed she had foreseen her own death had captured the imagination of everyone in Mellard. Some dismissed her words with nervous laughter, brushing it off as nothing more than a product of an overactive mind. Others, however, felt an unsettling chill in their bones as they recalled the certainty in her voice. Estelle, once a lively and graceful figure, had become a puzzle, her once radiant eyes now shadowed by the knowledge of a fate that awaited her. Her husband, Richard Carrington, the ever-pragmatic banker, had ridiculed her prediction as mere dramatics, calling it a passing fancy. Yet, those who truly knew Estelle, her lifelong friend Lillian Drake, the housemaid Betty, even the vicar's wife, were not so quick to dismiss the woman's certainty. They knew Estelle wasn't given to flights of fancy, and they had started to question whether there was more to her ominous words. It wasn't just a nervous delusion. Estelle believed she would die in exactly 3 days. When Miss Marple arrived once more to meet Estelle, she found her in the same drawing room, where the air seemed heavy with the weight of unspoken things. Estelle sat still, her fingers trembling ever so slightly, as she clutched her teacup, her eyes darting around the room as though searching for something that was not there. Miss Marple, ever observant, remarked on the unsettling calmness in Estelle's demeanor. Estelle wasn't afraid of death itself, she admitted with a small humorless laugh, but of the knowledge of it, of the feeling that somehow, her death had already occurred in another realm, and she was simply waiting for it to catch up with her. Miss Marple, with her unshakable sense of intuition, knew this wasn't some flight of fancy. There was something deeper, something unknown, lurking in Estelle's words. The village could debate and whisper, but Miss Marple had seen enough to know that this mystery was far more complex than anyone had imagined. In 3 days, Estelle Carrington would be dead, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover the truth behind this eerie prophecy before the clock ran out. As the clock struck midnight, a haunting silence enveloped the village, broken only by a piercing scream that sliced through the stillness. The villagers, their doubts and skepticism hanging in the air like a fog, now found themselves gripped by an unsettling fear. The doors of the Carrington house swung open, and shadows darted to the windows, peering in with bated breath. It was Lillian Drake who reached the house first, her heart pounding in her chest as she found Estelle's body at the foot of the grand staircase, her breath caught in her throat, her hands instinctively pressed to her mouth, as if holding back another scream. There, sprawled in unnatural stillness, was Estelle, her body twisted at an impossible angle, her deep blue silk dressing gown untouched by any sign of struggle or violence. Richard Carrington, eyes wide in feigned horror, rushed in behind her, followed by Dr. Graves, who knelt beside Estelle's lifeless form. His voice cracked as he confirmed what they all feared: she was gone. The village's rational facade crumbled as whispers spread like wildfire. Estelle had foretold her own death, and now it had come to pass. Miss Marple, ever calm, stepped forward, her eyes scanning the scene with precision. The house was too quiet, the atmosphere too still. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no desperate final words, just an eerie calmness that sent a shiver down her spine. Her sharp gaze fell upon Estelle's hands. One was open, palm facing upwards, while the other was clenched tightly. With a practiced eye, Miss Marple noted the torn scrap of dark fabric peeking through the clenched fingers. Dr. Graves, still uncertain, suggested Estelle had simply tripped, but Miss Marple, unmoved, questioned how such a fall could leave the gown perfectly smooth, without a single wrinkle. The doctor faltered under her scrutiny. Miss Marple's gaze swept up to the staircase, then back to Estelle, her mind working swiftly. This was no accident. The air was too still, the scene too deliberately arranged. Kneeling beside the body, Miss Marple gently pried open Estelle's clenched fingers, revealing the dark scrap of fabric hidden within her grasp. What was its significance? Miss Marple's patience was legendary, and she knew that the truth, hidden in plain sight, was waiting to be unearthed. There was more to this mystery, and she would uncover it, piece by piece, until every dark secret was brought into the light. As the morning sun rose, the village of Carrington was split by an eerie tension. The tragic death of Estelle Carrington had left whispers lingering in the air, dividing those who believed in the supernatural and those who clung to rationality. Some spoke of fate, of prophecy fulfilled in the most terrifying way, casting nervous glances at the house where Estelle had once lived. Others, far more skeptical, dismissed it all, muttering that accidents were simply that, accidents. But Miss Marple, ever vigilant, knew better. She observed the subtle undercurrent of fear that ran deeper than superstition. The villagers weren't just afraid of the unknown, they feared each other. Richard Carrington, the grieving husband, had failed to show the expected grief, instead spending his time with calculated precision, handling his late wife's affairs with a cold, businesslike demeanor. Lillian Drake, the friend who had shared Estelle's final heated words, was another suspicious figure. Then there was Dr. Henry Graves, the doctor who had dismissed Estelle's warnings, now finding himself under scrutiny. and Matthew Lawson, the reclusive bookseller, who had always watched Estelle from the shadows, never too close, but always present. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind racing. The real question was not what had happened that night, but who had made it happen. Richard's demeanor spoke volumes, the way he had calmly inquired about the execution of Estelle's will, a document that had been mysteriously revised. A chilling realization settled in Miss Marple's mind. This was no random tragedy. Someone had orchestrated Estelle's death, weaving a narrative of fate to cover their tracks. The pieces were falling into place, and Miss Marple was determined to find out who among them had played the role of the puppet master. Richard Carrington's casual dismissal of his wife's tragic death lingered in the air like a foul stench, as if he spoke more of an inconvenient business transaction than the loss of a loved one. "Terrible business," he had muttered, his voice soft but laced with a disturbing detachment. His words echoed in Miss Marple's mind as she stood outside the post office, watching him leave with that same calculated calm. His sorrow was not the raw anguish one would expect from a man who had just lost his wife. Instead, there was a studied quality to his grief, as though he were merely following a script. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the subtle shifts in his demeanor. He seemed less distraught and more prepared, as if he had been waiting for something like this to happen. It wasn't the surprise of loss that troubled him, but the inconvenience it caused, the disturbance to his neatly ordered life. As he turned to leave, she asked with a quiet, almost absent curiosity, if Estelle had mentioned her premonition. Richard hesitated, just a fraction, but enough for Miss Marple to catch the shift in his composure. "She spoke to everyone about it," he said, his voice dripping with practiced indifference. "I tried to tell her those thoughts can become self-fulfilling, you know." With that he walked away, disappearing into the distance. Miss Marple stood still, her mind turning over the words he had spoken. There was a subtle difference between a self-fulfilling prophecy and one carefully orchestrated to come true, and Richard Carrington understood that difference all too well. Meanwhile, Lily Drake's grief was far more visceral, but it was tainted by something darker. She had been Estelle's closest friend, and yet in the days leading up to Estelle's death, their bond had become strained, frayed by an undercurrent of tension. Lily had been the first to arrive at Carrington House that fateful night, the first to scream when she saw Estelle's lifeless body at the foot of the stairs, and the first to insist, vehemently, that this was no accident. "I knew something was wrong," she told Miss Marple, her voice trembling as she clutched Miss Marple's hand. Her face was twisted with guilt, as though the weight of something unsaid burdened her conscience. "I should have done something. I should have Tom and Nicole." Her words faltered, and she blinked rapidly, as though trying to chase away a thought that terrified her too much to speak aloud. Miss Marple remained patient, waiting for Lily to continue, but it seemed that the words were caught somewhere deep inside her. Finally Lily exhaled sharply, shaking her head, and whispered, "We argued 2 days before she died. About what, you ask? Nothing." But the way she said nothing held more weight than any explanation she could have given. The air around them seemed thick with the unsaid, the unspoken truth that hung heavy between them, just out of reach. Miss Marple's sharp instincts told her that Lily's words, or lack thereof, were just as revealing as any confession. Something had happened before Estelle's death, something that had strained their once unshakable friendship, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it, no matter how deeply it was buried. Lily Drake quickly corrected herself, her voice faltering. "I mean trivial things. I was just worried about her." The words tumbled out in a rush, as though she were trying to outrun them, and Miss Marple caught every detail. Her eyes never left Lily, noting the way the younger woman's hands twisted restlessly in her lap, fingers tightening and loosening in an almost frantic rhythm, betraying the emotions she desperately tried to control. Miss Marple, ever patient and unassuming, leaned forward just slightly, the quiet force of her presence prompting Lily to continue. She had been so convinced about this premonition. Lily said, her voice trembling, "I told her it was nonsense. She became angry, said I wasn't listening to her." The tremor in Lily's voice, the way her gaze darted around as if seeking escape from the heavy truth she was sharing, wasn't lost on Miss Marple. She could see the guilt, the burden of an unspoken admission, weighing on Lily's shoulders. Miss Marple's gaze softened with understanding, as she asked, her tone gentle but piercing, And were you listening, dear? The question hung in the air, as if the answer was both the key to the mystery and the door to Lily's inner turmoil. Lily's breath hitched before she blinked rapidly, struggling to gather her thoughts. She hesitated, her voice caught somewhere between a whisper and a confession. No, it was a quiet admission, but its weight was immense. She had failed her friend in a moment when listening, truly listening, could have made all the difference. Miss Marple patted Lily's hand reassuringly, her touch calm and steady, like the anchor in a storm. Tell me, Lily, when you last saw Estelle, was she afraid of dying? Miss Marple's voice was soft, almost tender, but her words were direct, probing. Lily's throat tightened, the simple question pushing her to confront something deep within herself. She swallowed hard, her lips trembling as she replied. She was afraid of something. There was a hesitation in Lily's tone, a reluctant understanding that the word death didn't quite capture the essence of Estelle's fear. It wasn't death itself that had terrorized her friend, but something far more intangible, something lurking in the shadows. Miss Marple, perceptive as always, understood that distinction. The fear wasn't just about an end, but about what lay beyond it. Meanwhile, Dr. Henry Graves, the respected physician who prided himself on logic, reason, and his scientific mind, had been quick to dismiss Estelle's premonition, attributing it to the workings of an overactive imagination and nervous anxiety. A classic case of self-induced panic, he had said just days before her death, speaking to the villagers with the assuredness of a man who saw the world in black and white terms. It was the sort of diagnosis he was known for, rational, grounded, offering explanations that fit neatly into the framework of medical science. But now, in the wake of Estelle's untimely death, and the eerily accurate fulfillment of her premonition, Dr. Graves was not as sure of himself. His usual composure had slipped, ever so slightly, and Miss Marple observed every detail. His hands, normally steady and precise, were just a bit too careful now, almost mechanical. His eyes avoided direct confrontation. When asked about the night Estelle had fallen, had he really been elsewhere, as he claimed? Miss Marple found herself wondering. More troubling, however, was his relationship with Estelle. He had been her doctor, but had there been more to it? Lily's voice faltered as she spoke again, her words heavy with something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. Was it unease? Regret? She trusted him, Lily had confided, her eyes darting to the side, as though the truth of her statement were too much to bear. She told him things she wouldn't tell Richard. That was significant. A confidant, someone who not only dismissed her fears, but also held intimate knowledge of her life, of her vulnerabilities. Was it possible that Dr. Graves had known something more, something he hadn't shared? His demeanor, his attempt to project confidence, couldn't mask the subtle flicker of unease in his eyes. It wasn't grief, nor guilt, but something much more disquieting, a realization that Miss Marple couldn't ignore. His answers were firm, his chin held high, but the faintest tension in his voice betrayed him. What did he know? And then there was Matthew Lawson, the bookshop owner, who appeared to have no remarkable qualities, nothing about him to suggest he would ever be of any significance in this unfolding mystery. He was a man of quiet habits, blending seamlessly into the background of village life. He was mild-mannered and reserved, rarely speaking unless spoken to, and yet Miss Marple couldn't shake the strange pattern that had emerged in his behavior. He had attended every gathering Estelle hosted, never intruding, always standing at the edges of conversations, his eyes constantly following Estelle with an intensity that felt out of place. His presence wasn't just a matter of being in the same room. It was as though he had been observing, studying, perhaps waiting for something. It was peculiar, almost unnerving. What drew him to her? Miss Marple mused. Was it simply the quiet fascination of a bookish man with a woman of prominence, or was there something deeper, something darker at play? He had no obvious motives, no outward displays of interest, but the more Miss Marple thought about it, the more she felt that Lawson's role in Estelle's life was something to be explored further. What was the nature of his attachment to her? Was it the harmless infatuation of a shy, solitary man, or did he have a secret, one that tied him to Estelle's untimely death? He had always been present at the edges of her life, like a shadow that never quite disappeared, and Miss Marple's instincts told her that shadows were often the places where the darkest secrets hid. As the pieces of the puzzle began to form in Miss Marple's mind, the threads of suspicion wove themselves tighter, drawing all eyes back to those who had been closest to Estelle, each with their own hidden motives, each with a secret to keep. "She was remarkable, Doctor," Graves said simply, his voice steady, yet Miss Marple noted the subtle twitch of his fingers as they twisted the edge of his cuff, an unconscious movement that betrayed his calm demeanor. "So full of ideas," he continued, his voice almost nostalgic, "and yet, you never spoke to her much," Miss Marple remarked quietly, her eyes studying him. There was a momentary hesitation before he answered, his tone slightly off. "She didn't notice me." His words, though seemingly innocent, hung in the air, laden with an oddness that Miss Marple couldn't ignore. Not "we were not acquainted," but rather "she didn't notice me." The choice of words felt telling. There was something unsettling in the way he said it, almost as though he had been watching her from the shadows, unnoticed but obsessed. Lily Drake, too, had recalled once finding Matthew lingering outside Carrington House. His excuse had been vague, and his presence unnoticed by others, but Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. On the night of Estelle's death, Matthew had been absent, or so he claimed. Miss Marple scrutinized him for a moment longer. He didn't seem dangerous, but Miss Marple knew from years of experience that obsession, unchecked and silent, could take many forms. It didn't always shout, sometimes it whispered, lurking beneath the surface. She was patient as ever, and took her time observing the villagers. Sitting at Edith Weatherby's table, stirring a lump of sugar into her tea, Miss Marple's eyes roamed over the faces of those who had come and gone. She noticed those who avoided eye contact, the ones who seemed just a little too restless, and those who laughed too loudly, masking their discomfort. Lily Drake, twisting her hands nervously, couldn't hide the flicker of unease whenever Richard Carrington's name was mentioned. "Doctor." Graves kept his voice measured, but his fingers tapped absently on his desk, betraying an undercurrent of tension. Richard Carrington, always composed, faltered slightly when Miss Marple mentioned Estelle's will. It was a fraction of a pause, barely perceptible, but enough to make Miss Marple take note. And Matthew Lawson, polite and mild-mannered, had stiffened noticeably when Estelle's name was mentioned. One of them, Miss Marple was sure, knew more than they were letting on, and as always, she would find out who. Later she sat in quiet contemplation, the piece of dark fabric resting on the table before her. It was small, easily overlooked by others, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the significance of it. Estelle had clutched it tightly in her final moments, her fingers locking around it in a silent, desperate defiance. It didn't match the rest of her clothing. Miss Marple delicately turned it over in her hands, tracing the edges where it had been torn. The frayed threads told a story of struggle. This wasn't an accident. This was a struggle, a desperate attempt to free something, or perhaps someone, from her grasp. If Estelle had held on to this fabric in her final moments, it could only mean one thing. Someone had been with her, someone close enough to reach out, close enough to tear it from her grasp. The realization settled over Miss Marple like a fog, thick and chilling. Her gaze lifted slowly as Edith Weatherby, ever the gracious host, poured another cup of tea for her. "So odd, isn't it?" Edith murmured absent-mindedly. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately, her mind racing as the clues began to fit together, each one leading her closer to the truth. This was no ordinary case. Estelle's death was a carefully woven tapestry of lies, obsession, and hidden motives, and Miss Marple was on the verge of unraveling it all. Miss Marple's mind raced as she sat in the quiet room, listening to Edith Weatherby's words fade into the background. Edith had been speaking, but Miss Marple was not truly hearing her. Her attention was entirely absorbed by the fabric that lay on the table before her. The piece of torn cloth, so small yet so significant, had caught Estelle's grasp in her final moments, a sign of struggle, of a life that had been abruptly and violently cut short. Miss Marple's fingers lightly traced the frayed edges of the fabric, her mind unraveling a theory that seemed to grow with every passing thought. The fabric didn't match Estelle's clothing. It was an odd thing to find in her hand, especially in the circumstances surrounding her death. A person would not instinctively grab a banister dressed in cloth, and so it was clear, this scrap of fabric was not an accidental piece of her attire. It had come from something, or someone else. She looked up slowly, her eyes clouded with thought. Yes, banisters don't wear cloth, Miss Marple remarked quietly, her voice carrying the weight of her contemplation. Edith didn't respond, but the words had already drifted into silence, unnoticed by the bustling villagers who went about their daily tasks in the village square. Miss Marple's attention was firmly fixed on the mystery at hand, and her thoughts were with Estelle now, Estelle who had shown signs of knowing something dark, something no one had paid enough attention to. She closed her eyes and remembered the night of Estelle's death, the hushed whispers of the gathered villagers, their faces contorted with shock and horror, but beneath it, something else, guilt. It was there in the corners of their eyes, the nervous glances they exchanged when no one was looking. Someone had been hiding something, and that someone would soon be revealed. Among them, there was one thing that was missing, one thing that no one had noticed until now, the torn fabric that Estelle had held on to so desperately in her final moments. It wasn't just a piece of clothing, it was a key, a clue to the puzzle, and Miss Marple would find it, even if it took every ounce of her experience and patience. As Edith continued to speak, her words blurred, becoming background noise. Miss Marple's mind wandered back to the night Estelle had spoken her final words. "The staircase is too silent," she had whispered. At the time, Miss Marple had dismissed it as a vague, nervous remark, something that made no real sense in the moment. But now everything had shifted. The weight of that statement took on a new, more foreboding meaning. She could see it all, Estelle standing there, at the foot of the grand staircase in Carrington House, sensing the silence around her. It was a silence that shouldn't have been there. The house, old and creaky, should have moaned under the weight of every footstep, each movement echoing in the heavy air, but it hadn't. And now Miss Marple understood. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound, it was a warning. Had Estelle known too much? Too late? The house had been too quiet, too still. There had been something, or someone, missing. That sense of expectation of the normal sounds had been disrupted. Estelle had felt it. She had noticed that something was wrong, perhaps even recognized her danger, but it was too late to save herself. However, she had been sharp enough to know that the danger was real. Perhaps Miss Marple thought she had even realized who her killer was in that last fleeting moment. The tragedy was that Estelle had never had the chance to warn anyone. As Miss Marple pondered this, her fingers tapped gently against the armrest of her chair. It wasn't the absence of sound that mattered most. It was the expectation of sound that had been violated. Something had changed that night. Something unseen. Something that had tipped Estelle off just before her death. But what had it been? What had altered the normal course of events? Miss Marple's mind churned through the possibilities, trying to make sense of the puzzle. She could almost see Estelle's face in her mind, pale, apprehensive, eyes wide with realization. The silence had been her warning. It was her final clue, the last thread of evidence she had left behind. And it was a thread that Miss Marple would pull until the entire mystery unraveled. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself sitting across from Betty, the Carrington household's maid, a quiet, nervous girl who seemed ill at ease under Miss Marple's steady gaze. Betty fidgeted with her apron, her eyes darting from side to side as though she feared someone might overhear them. When Miss Marple asked her about Estelle's final moments, Betty hesitated, her words coming out in a hushed, uncertain whisper. "I don't understand it, ma'am," she confessed. She locked herself in. "I know she did. I heard the bolt slide into place." Miss Marple nodded, taking careful note of Betty's words. There was something important here, something out of place, and yet she was found at the foot of the stairs. Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but insistent. Betty's face paled further, and she swallowed hard. "That's what's wrong, isn't it? No one could have gotten in." The implication of her statement hung in the air between them. Miss Marple studied the maid, noticing the fear that wasn't quite the fear of guilt, but rather the fear of the unexplained, the fear of something beyond her understanding. "Locks can be picked," Miss Marple mused softly, "and duplicate keys can be made, but a bolted door." She paused, letting the silence stretch between them. It was an interesting point, one that didn't sit well with the facts she had gathered so far. A bolted door was not easily breached, and yet if the door had been opened from the inside, it meant someone must have been there with Estelle, Someone who had manipulated the situation just enough to confuse the timeline. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back to the torn fabric, to the silent staircase, to the strange, eerie quiet that had marked Estelle's final moments. She turned back to Betty, her voice low and steady. "Tell me, Betty, when you found Estelle, was the door still bolted?" Betty hesitated, and Miss Marple could see her nerves getting the better of her. "No," Betty whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, it was open." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, her mind racing as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. If the door had been opened from the inside, then the killer had been in the room with Estelle, but how had they left without making a sound? And what about the silence of the staircase? Everything about this case screamed of careful planning, a mind that had anticipated every move. One of the villagers knew more than they were saying, and Miss Marple would not rest until she uncovered the truth. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened as she looked at Betty, the maid, who paled under the pressure of the question. "Did you open the door?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but firm. The girl shook her head rapidly, her eyes wide with fear. "No, ma'am." A chill ran down Miss Marple's spine. "Then someone else had," she said quietly, almost to herself, but the words hung in the air like a heavy fog. "Someone who shouldn't have been there at all." Her thoughts swirled, piecing together the strange disjointed clues, each one leading her closer to the truth. Miss Marple had always believed that timing was rarely a matter of coincidence. If someone had changed their will just days before their death, it was never by accident. Sitting in the office of Mr. Albertson, the village solicitor, Miss Marple listened intently as the man shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his spectacles glinting nervously as he avoided her gaze. After a long pause, he finally confessed. Yes, he admitted reluctantly, Mrs. Carrington did request a revision to her will. It was rather unexpected. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing with interest. "And what precisely did she change?" she asked, her tone deceptively soft. Mr. Albertson hesitated, his fingers twitching on the desk as though he hoped the words would somehow be easier to say. Finally he sighed, resigned to the truth. She increased a bequest to Lillian Drake, removed a certain investment meant for her husband. He cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the conversation, and she named a new beneficiary for a portion of her estate. "Personal matter," she said. Miss Marple's mind was already working, piecing the details together. "Who was the new beneficiary?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mr. Albertson adjusted his glasses before speaking again, the words hanging in the air like a slow drumbeat. "Matthew Lawson," he said, glancing at the paper in front of him, as though the name were foreign to him. Miss Marple's eyes flashed. Matthew Lawson, the quiet bookseller, a man who had barely spoken a word to Estelle, yet he had suddenly become worthy of a significant inheritance. It didn't make sense. And then there was Richard Carrington, a man who, it seemed, had much to lose from Estelle's sudden changes. The timing of it all was too neat, too precise, and Miss Marple knew that meant something was terribly wrong. With a polite nod, she thanked Mr. Albertson, and left the room, already formulating a plan in her mind. She knew the truth before Albertson had even finished speaking. Someone had found out about the will changes before Estelle's death. That meant the will wasn't just a revision, it was a motive powerful enough to kill for. That evening, under the watchful eyes of the housemaid Betty, Miss Marple's keen instincts led her to the discovery she had been waiting for, a letter, hastily shoved into Estelle's drawer, its edges crinkled, as if it had been handled in a hurry. The handwriting was unmistakably Estelle's, but the contents of the letter were far more troubling. Miss Marple read the words carefully, absorbing the weight of them. "I know now it was never a premonition," the letter began. "It was something I saw, something I was not meant to see." The ink trailed slightly, as though Estelle's hand had hesitated before continuing. "I will set things right. I cannot pretend I do not know. I will make my decision tomorrow. After that I hope to be safe." Miss Marple exhaled slowly, her mind racing. Estelle had not foreseen her death. She had understood it. She had discovered something dangerous, something that threatened not only her life but the lives of others as well. Perhaps Estelle had thought she could make things right, reason with the truth, and somehow protect herself. But in the end, she had left behind a trail of breadcrumbs, a trail leading to Miss Marple. the one person who might understand, the one person who might uncover the truth, before it was too late. The puzzle was almost complete. The puzzle pieces began to fall into place for Miss Marple, each detail sharpening her focus on the truth. A revised will, a silent staircase, a clenched fist gripping fabric. Someone had silenced Estelle before she could act on what she had discovered, but Miss Marple had no intention of allowing that silence to remain unbroken. She folded Estelle's letter carefully, her mind already made up. It was time to set a trap. Miss Marple had spent a lifetime observing human nature, and she knew that guilt rarely revealed itself through grand gestures. It hid in the smallest details, in the tiny shifts that others often overlooked. As she sat in Edith Weatherby's sitting room, her knitting needles moving with steady precision, she watched the suspects come and go. Their words were carefully measured, almost rehearsed, but their bodies told a different story. Richard Carrington, eager to appear composed, spoke too quickly, as though he had prepared for questions long before they were ever asked. He was a man who had studied his lines, anticipating each move. Lillian Drake, on the other hand, was the picture of anxiety, eyes darting, hands fidgeting, contradicting herself in minutes. First she claimed Estelle had been anxious that night, then later said she seemed almost at peace. Which was it, Doctor? Graves, once so confident in his diagnosis, now seemed too rigid, his every word carefully measured, as if any slip of the tongue might betray him. And Matthew Lawson, the quiet bookseller, who had once been an observer, now found himself speaking far too much, offering explanations where none were needed. Miss Marple sipped her tea, offering only a pleasant smile as the conversation flowed around her. Each of them was hiding something, and the more they tried to mask it, the clearer it became. In her experience, murders were rarely about the present, they were about the past coming back to collect its due, and it was an offhand remark from the vicar's wife that set Miss Marple on the right path. "Poor Estelle," the woman murmured, her voice heavy with sympathy. She tried so hard to leave it all behind her. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-motion. "Leave what behind, dear?" she asked, her tone mild but probing. The woman hesitated, glancing nervously around the room before she sighed deeply. "There was an incident years ago, something to do with a man from London. It was hushed up, of course. Richard insisted on it." Miss Marple's lips pressed together in thought. Blackmail. Estelle's so-called premonition might have been nothing more than a slow realization that someone had uncovered her secret. Someone had found the thing she had tried so hard to bury, and they were using it against her. Had Estelle been paying for her silence, only to refuse when the price became too high? Miss Marple had seen it before, the past lurking in the shadows, ready to claim its due, and now it seemed it had finally come for Estelle. The past never truly remained buried. It had a way of clawing its way back to the surface at the most inopportune moment, and when it did, people would kill to keep it hidden. Miss Marple spent the morning inspecting the grand staircase of Carrington House, moving with the quiet patience of someone who already knew exactly what she would find. A house of such age would naturally creak and groan underfoot, but there was something wrong about the stairs, something she couldn't quite place until her trained eyes caught the faintest glimmer of oil. She reached into her handbag, pulled out a handkerchief, and gently ran it along one of the middle steps. A faint, greasy sheen clung to the fabric, subtle but unmistakable. Holding it up to the light, she saw it clearly. Oil, too fine to be noticed underfoot, too smooth to detect with the naked eye, but enough to make an unsuspecting woman lose her footing. It was no accident. This was a carefully orchestrated act, designed to send Estelle Carrington tumbling to her death. And then there was the banister, polished that very morning by the housemaid, yet not a single fingerprint remained. No last desperate grasp to catch herself. Estelle hadn't even had the chance to try. It was staged, meticulously planned. The murderer had known Estelle would use those stairs that night, and they had ensured she would not survive the fall. It had been executed with chilling precision. As the day wore on, rumors in the village began to grow like ivy creeping up an old stone wall, clinging, spreading, refusing to be ignored. By mid-morning, fresh whispers filled the air. Someone had seen a figure near Carrington House on the night Estelle died, someone who should not have been there. The revelation came from Mr. Pritchard, the elderly groundskeeper at the vicarage. He had remained silent at first, he explained, because he was old, not foolish, and some things were better left unsaid. But after a restless night, and a guilty conscience, he had finally come forward to Miss Marple. "I saw someone near the house that night," he said, his voice rough with age but firm with certainty. "Near the side entrance, the one facing the orchard." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, her eyes sharp and focused. "And who was it, Mr. Pritchard?" she asked gently, though she already knew the answer. "It was someone who swore they were somewhere else." Mr. Pritchard muttered, a direct contradiction. "Someone's been lying." Miss Marple pressed him for more details. How tall was the figure? What was their movement like? What hesitation did they show before disappearing into the shadows? Mr. Pritchard could not see their face, but one thing was certain: the figure had moved with purpose. Whoever they were, they had not stumbled upon the house by chance. They had gone there for a reason. The realization settled like a weight on Miss Marple's chest. Someone had been there that night, and they hadn't come to simply watch. They had come to ensure Estelle's death was no accident. And that reason, Miss Marple suspected, was murder. She had always believed that when it came to guilt, time was the greatest adversary. Secrets buried deep in the past could only remain hidden for so long before they resurfaced, usually at the most inconvenient and deadly of moments. People often killed to keep those secrets buried, believing that silencing one person would prevent the truth from spreading. But Miss Marple knew better. She had spent her life observing human nature, and if there was one thing she knew, it was that the truth would always claw its way to the surface, no matter how hard people tried to bury it. The guilty didn't always confess in grand dramatic moments. Sometimes they revealed themselves in the smallest, most subtle ways: a flinch, a hesitation, a stray comment spoken too quickly, or a look that lingered just a little too long. Miss Marple didn't rely on brute force or confrontation to uncover the truth. She understood that direct accusations only led to quick denials and empty explanations. Instead, she used the most effective tool at her disposal: human nature itself. People could hide behind words, but they couldn't hide their reactions. A well-placed comment, a seemingly innocent remark, a suggestive look, these were the things that unraveled the guilty. By midday, the village was buzzing with the new whispers. Someone had been seen near Carrington House on the night of Estelle's death, someone who shouldn't have been there. Miss Marple watched the suspects carefully, noting every shift in their demeanor, every subtle sign of discomfort. Who avoided her gaze, who suddenly seemed overly eager to leave the village, who made the fatal mistake of speaking too quickly, revealing their own nervousness. Miss Marple was patient. She knew that she didn't have to rush. The truth would reveal itself in time. She simply had to wait, and as she did, she could feel the tension in the room grow thicker. Every passing minute brought the guilty closer to exposing themselves. It was only a matter of time. The confrontation, the Carrington residence, had never felt so oppressively still. The heavy drapes hung like thick, suffocating curtains, muting the light, and casting the room in an eerie twilight. The air inside was stifling, but not with warmth. There was something far more unsettling in the atmosphere, something uncomfortable silence, that seemed to echo through the grand empty halls. Miss Marple sat in her usual high-backed chair, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She didn't need to fidget or adjust her position. She had all the time in the world, and she knew exactly what she was doing. Her eyes moved slowly, methodically from one person to the next, taking in every tiny detail, every subtle shift in posture, every flicker of emotion. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to slice through. Richard Carrington, his face a carefully controlled mask, sat with his arms crossed, his fingers tapped absently on the fabric of his sleeve, a small nervous tick that betrayed his calm exterior. His gaze remained fixed, but his eyes darted occasionally toward the door, as if considering his next move. Lillian Drake, pale and restless, shifted in her seat. Her eyes flicked anxiously from person to person, always searching for an escape, but never quite daring to make a move. The fear in her gaze was unmistakable, a tremor in her hands that she tried to hide by gripping the edges of her chair. She was the picture of a woman trapped by her own secrets, and Miss Marple saw through her completely. Dr. Henry Graves, usually so composed and confident, seemed different today. His usual air of superiority had cracked, and now he looked like a man on edge. Each time Miss Marple's eyes lingered on him, his jaw tightened ever so slightly, and his fingers drummed nervously against his knee. The very control that he prided himself on had begun to slip away, and Miss Marple knew it. Then there was Matthew Lawson, the quiet bookseller. He had remained largely silent throughout the ordeal, but now his silence seemed more unsettling than ever. He sat apart from the group, his fingers nervously twining around the edge of his cuff, an unconscious movement that revealed just how deeply his thoughts were running. His eyes were everywhere, darting from face to face, never staying still, betraying the anxiety he was trying so hard to conceal. Miss Marple cleared her throat gently, breaking the heavy silence. Her voice was soft and calm, almost conversational, but it carried the weight of her words. "I appreciate you all coming," she said, her gaze moving slowly across the room, resting on each person in turn. "You see, there are still a few matters that trouble me." The room seemed to hold its breath. No one spoke, no one moved, and yet, the tension grew thicker, wrapping around them all like a suffocating blanket. "I have always believed," Miss Marple continued, her voice even and measured, "that people reveal more in their silence than in their words, and I must say, there has been an awful lot of silence surrounding Estelle's death." The words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Lillian exhaled sharply, her body stiffening as she tried to hold herself together. Richard Carrington shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the faintest trace of a nervous tic betraying his calm demeanor. His hand, which had been resting casually on the arm of his chair, twitched slightly. It was a subtle movement, but to Miss Marple, it spoke volumes. The silence in the room grew deafening, the walls closing in as everyone waited for the inevitable. The first cracks in their facades were beginning to show. Miss Marple was closing in, and she could feel it. Soon the truth would finally emerge. The ticking of the clock in the house seemed to mark each passing second, with a deliberate slowness, amplifying the silence that had settled over the room. Miss Marple, however, did not seem to mind. In fact, she smiled, not with warmth, but with a knowing look, as though she were simply waiting for the moment to unravel. "Shall we begin?" she asked, her voice as calm as ever, allowing the tension to stretch out in the air before she continued. "I keep returning to Estelle's final words," she said, her tone almost conversational. "A curious thing, really. The staircase is too silent." She let the words hang there, suspended in the quiet room. It was as if the phrase itself had weight, echoing in the minds of the assembled suspects. The subtle suggestion in her words was not lost on anyone. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "it struck me as odd at first. A house of this age, well, wooden staircases tend to creak, do they not?" She glanced at Lillian, whose nervous glance betrayed her anxiety. "Yes," Lillian replied, her voice barely above a whisper, loudly. "Precisely," Miss Marple said, folding her hands with a small satisfied nod. And yet Estelle noticed something strange. She expected the stairs to creak, but they did not. A beat of silence followed, and Miss Marple let her gaze flicker briefly to Richard. His eyes widened ever so slightly, betraying a flicker of unease that he quickly masked. Dr. Graves' jaw tightened minutely, a faint sign of tension. Miss Marple didn't need to say a word, her observation had landed. "You see," she continued, her voice growing firmer, "this tells us two things. First, Estelle wasn't alone in that moment. She heard something, or rather she didn't hear something. And second," she paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle before glancing at Richard again, "someone had tampered with the stairs beforehand." The atmosphere in the room thickened, as if the very air was drawn tighter with every passing second. "Perhaps polished," Miss Marple suggested thoughtfully, "or waxed, or something else entirely." Matthew Lawson, seated slightly apart from the others, let out a shaky breath. "Oil," he muttered, almost to himself. "It would make them too smooth." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened instantly. "Yes, it would," she agreed, her voice light but carrying the weight of her insight. She leaned back slightly, her posture composed but her words poised to strike at the heart of the mystery. "So you see," she continued, her tone deliberate, "Estelle's death was not fate, not some prophecy fulfilled. No, it was something far more deliberate. Across from her, Richard's breath caught ever so briefly, an involuntary pause that Miss Marple didn't miss. It was the smallest of slips, but it spoke volumes. The room had become thick with unease, with each person now waiting for Miss Marple's next words. She reached into her handbag with slow, deliberate movements, as if she had all the time in the world. When she pulled out a small dark scrap of fabric and laid it gently on the table before her, a ripple of tension moved through the group. No one spoke, but the air crackled with the weight of their collective realization. This, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but resolute, was found clutched in Estelle's hand. Her fingers brushed over the torn edges of the fabric, drawing everyone's attention to it. "It does not match her gown," she continued, her words slicing through the silence like a blade, "which can only mean one thing. This piece of fabric belongs to someone else, someone who was near enough for Estelle to grab at the very last moment." As she let her words sink in, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to drift slowly around the room. Her eyes scanned the faces of each suspect, searching for the smallest flicker of recognition, the involuntary reaction that would reveal the truth. The tension was palpable, each person holding their breath, and the room seemed to hold a collective heartbeat. In that moment, it became clear one of them had just made their mistake, and Miss Marple was waiting for the truth to spill from their lips. The room held its breath as Miss Marple, with a quiet yet deliberate motion, turned her gaze to Richard Carrington. His face, though seemingly composed, betrayed the faintest tension, something Miss Marple had already noticed. A small but crucial detail stood out to her, the missing piece from the cuff of his dressing robe. With a slight tilt of her head, she suggested, "Shall we compare them?" The challenge hung in the air, thick with suspense. For a long moment, no one moved. Richard's gaze shifted, and then, with a sharp exhale, he pushed back his chair, his movements quick and defensive. "This is absurd," he snapped, his voice strained with a mix of anger and panic. "You're making wild assumptions based on nothing more than an old woman's paranoia." Miss Marple's eyes glinted with quiet confidence as she tilted her head, her voice light but unwavering. "Ah, but you see, Mr. Carrington, it isn't paranoia when it turns out to be true." Richard's hand twitched imperceptibly at his side, his hesitation a fraction too long. That small slip, barely noticeable, was enough. Miss Marple knew without a doubt that he had been with Estelle the night of her death. She allowed the silence to stretch on, the weight of it pressing down on him. Finally she spoke again, her voice crisp, cutting through the tension. "This was never about fate," she said, her words clear and deliberate. "Estelle Carrington's death was designed, carefully orchestrated to look like a prophecy fulfilled." Richard scoffed, though the unease in his eyes was unmistakable. Miss Marple pressed on, unfazed by his dismissal. "You knew, Mr. Carrington, that Estelle had convinced herself of her impending death. It wasn't difficult to use that against her, to set the stage, so to speak." She turned to the others, her gaze sweeping across the room. "The staircase was tampered with, the doors were locked. The very thing that should have saved her, her own instinct for danger, became the trap you set." Lillian gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she shook her head, clearly struggling to comprehend the extent of the deception. "But why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why go to such lengths?" Miss Marple's expression softened slightly, but her eyes remained sharp, her words precise. "Because she changed her will," she said simply. The revelation landed with a soft gasp from Matthew Lawson, and a nervous swallow from Dr. Graves. "She altered the terms, didn't she, Mr. Carrington?" Miss Marple's gaze never wavered, and you couldn't afford to let that stand. Richard's jaw tightened, his silence a confession in itself. The prophecy had never been real, Miss Marple realized. The only thing inevitable about Estelle's death was the man who had orchestrated it. Without warning, Richard lunged from his chair, his sudden movement shocking Lillian into a frightened cry. Dr. Graves instinctively stepped back, his face pale with a mix of disbelief and fear, yet Miss Marple did not flinch. Her hands remained folded, her gaze unwavering. "I won't sit here and listen to this nonsense," Richard spat, his voice tight with barely contained panic. "You're all fools." Estelle was unstable. His words faltered, his breath hitching in his chest. Miss Marple remained composed, her voice calm, almost reflective. "You were careful," she mused, "but not careful enough. The finality of her statement hung in the air, a quiet declaration of the truth Richard had so desperately tried to hide. In that moment, the room seemed to hold its collective breath, the reality of what had happened beginning to settle like dust. Richard's attempt at a defense had crumbled, and Miss Marple's quiet certainty had shattered the illusion he'd tried so hard to maintain. Richard's lips parted, his carefully constructed mask faltering for the briefest of moments. "You have no proof," he hissed, his voice laced with venom. "You have nothing." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, almost pitying, as she sighed, a quiet sound that seemed to echo through the tense silence. "Ah, but we do, Mr. Carrington," she said, her voice gentle yet unyielding. "Your own words just now, you never denied being there that night. Only that we couldn't prove it." A flicker of realization flashed in Richard's eyes, a sharp involuntary recognition that he had said too much. The room seemed to freeze, the moment stretching thin as wire, taut with anticipation. Before anyone could react, Richard bolted for the door, his desperation palpable. But he was not quick enough. Dr. Graves, despite his earlier hesitation, moved with a speed that belied his age, catching Richard's arm with a firm grip that stopped him in his tracks. Richard struggled, but the fight had already left him. He was cornered, and Miss Marple, watching the scene unfold with quiet composure, offered only a small shake of her head. "There is no escape from the truth, Mr. Carrington," she stated simply, and indeed, there was none. The final twist, Richard Carrington ceased his futile struggles, his breath ragged and uneven, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, as though trying to hold on to whatever semblance of control he had left. The weight of Miss Marple's words pressed down on him like a shroud, suffocating him with the realization that there was nowhere left to run. At last, his voice broke the silence. "Fine," he muttered, the words heavy with defeat. "Yes, I was there that night. I went to see Estelle." He hesitated, the admission clearly costing him more than he had anticipated. "We argued." The words tumbled out in a rush, as if he were trying to force himself to believe the narrative he was creating. She was unstable, kept talking about fate, about seeing her own death. She must have lost her footing. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes sharp as she watched him. The fabric she held in her hand seemed to grow heavier in the air between them. Richard's jaw tightened, the strain of his confession evident in the muscles that clenched beneath his skin. "I don't know," he continued, his voice faltering. "Maybe she grabbed at me in panic." The vagueness of his answer was calculated, a carefully chosen veil to hide the truth. Miss Marple's knitting needles remained motionless in her lap, her hands steady, her gaze unwavering. She did not speak, she simply waited, allowing the silence to press in on Richard, forcing him to confront the weight of his own words. His shoulders sagged, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he added, "I didn't mean for it to happen. But she was always so fragile." Lillian let out a quiet gasp, her hand flying to her mouth in disbelief. Dr. Graves glanced away, his discomfort palpable, yet something was wrong. Miss Marple's instincts, honed over years of solving mysteries, told her that this confession wasn't what it seemed. She had heard confessions before, some desperate and trembling, others cold and calculated. But this felt off, as though Richard was merely reciting a script rather than confessing the truth. Her fingers curled gently around her knitting, her eyes never leaving Richard Carrington. No, she thought quietly to herself, this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Someone else had been pulling the strings all along, and Miss Marple knew she had only uncovered the surface of a much deeper deception. With a slow exhale, she finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "No," she said simply, "that won't do at all." The finality in her tone was unmistakable, signaling that the game was far from finished. The truth, it seemed, was still hidden beneath layers of lies, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover every last secret. Richard's eyes snapped up, the confusion evident on his face. "What? You didn't kill her?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, even soothing, as she spoke, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. "You were there, yes. You argued, yes. But Estelle was already a dead woman, walking long before you set foot in that house." A cold stillness fell over the room, as those words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on everyone present. Miss Marple's gaze moved past Richard, her eyes settling on Lillian Drake, whose hands were tightly folded in her lap. Lillian's face was pale, her eyes wide, almost too wide, as if she were trying to hold herself together in the face of an unseen storm. Her silence was deafening, and Miss Marple took a small deliberate breath, her voice as gentle as ever. "You were the one who encouraged Estelle's fears, weren't you?" she asked, whispered about fate, reinforced her belief that she was doomed to die. "And when she changed her will, well, that must have been quite the disappointment to you." Lillian's lips parted in protest, but no words came. "That's ridiculous," she stammered, though the uncertainty in her voice betrayed her. I was her friend." Miss Marple gave a small nod, almost as if acknowledging the lie before it had even been fully spoken. "Yes," she said softly, her voice cutting through the room, like a whisper on the wind. "And who else would she confide in, if not a trusted friend?" Lillian's breath caught in her throat, her eyes darting nervously as the weight of Miss Marple's words settled over her. But the detective was not finished. "You were the one who made sure the stairs were slick with oil, weren't you?" Miss Marple continued, her voice never wavering. "Planted the idea of an inevitable death, so that when the time came, no one would question it." Richard turned his head sharply toward Lillian, confusion written all over his face. "Lillian?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. But Miss Marple, unfazed, continued her quiet unraveling of the truth. "You didn't have to push her yourself," she said softly. "You simply made sure that when she walked into her own doom, there would be no way back." And then for the first time, Lillian Drake broke the silence. Her face was a mask of disbelief, pale and tight with fear, but she said nothing. She sat there, breath coming in short, uneven gasps, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Miss Marple allowed the silence to stretch, the tension thick in the air. It wasn't until the room had fallen completely still that she spoke again. "It was a rather ingenious plan," she said, her voice contemplative, as she studied Lillian. "You knew Estelle so well, didn't you? You knew how deeply she feared what she believed was inevitable. And so, you did what all truly clever murderers do. You made your victim walk willingly into their own doom." A soft gasp escaped Lillian's lips, but she made no move to defend herself. Her hands tightened even further, her knuckles turning white. "You reinforced her fears," Miss Marple continued, her voice soft, yet unrelenting. "Encouraged them, and when the time came, you didn't push her. No, Lillian, you simply ensured that when she walked to her fate, there would be no escape, no turning back." Miss Marple's gaze flicked to Richard Carrington, her eyes narrowing as she addressed him directly. "You see, Richard," she said, her voice cool and measured, "your guilt lies not in the act of murder, but in your silence. You suspected, didn't you? But it was far more convenient to let events unfold without intervention. After all, it kept you in the clear, didn't it?" Richard's jaw tightened, the muscle working as his mind raced. He had been complicit, yes, but how far had his involvement truly gone? Miss Marple's eyes held him firmly in place, her piercing gaze unwavering, as though daring him to deny what they both knew to be true. Richard stood frozen, his mind spinning with a sense of helplessness. He had been complicit, yes, but not the mastermind. Miss Marple's gaze shifted back to Lillian, her eyes dissecting every detail, every nuance of the situation. The torn fabric, the silence that filled the air on those stairs, the oil slicked across them. Miss Marple spoke slowly, each word precise, as if laying out the final pieces of a carefully constructed puzzle. "And of course the final piece, the revised will. You had everything to gain, and nothing to lose." Lillian inhaled sharply, a sound that was both a sob and a nervous laugh. It was a reaction that barely masked the panic rising in her chest. Miss Marple gave a small nod, as if confirming what she already knew. The puzzle was complete, and the image it painted was damning. Lillian's calculated manipulation had led to Estelle's demise. Lillian's protests grew fainter as she was escorted away, her voice trailing off down the corridor. Richard remained still, staring at the floor, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He had not intervened, he had not tried to save her. Perhaps in some small quiet part of his soul, he too had seen it coming. the tragic end to a plan that had been set in motion long before they'd ever walked into that house. Dr. Graves, shaking his head in disbelief, whispered, "She really believed it, didn't she, that she was meant to die?" Miss Marple gave a slight smile, though there was no joy in it. "That," she said softly, "was the brilliance of the crime. You see, she was killed long before she set foot on those stairs. The death was written in her mind, long before it became a reality. Lillian didn't need to physically push her. All she had to do was plant the seed of inevitability, and watch Estelle walk willingly into her own fate. It was a crime born not of brute force, but of subtle manipulation, a crime that played on fear, on the human mind's greatest vulnerability, the belief in a predestined outcome. As the finality of the situation began to sink in, Miss Marple sighed softly, her voice betraying a hint of fatigue. "Justice has been served," she said, though the sentiment did little to comfort the empty space left by the tragedy. But still, something troubled her. Dr. Graves noticed her thoughtful expression, and frowned. "What is it, Miss Marple?" he asked, sensing her unease. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the window, her thoughts far away. If Estelle hadn't believed in her own death, would she still be alive? If she had not been made to believe in the inevitability of her fate, would things have turned out differently? The thought lingered in the silence that followed. Miss Marple could not say for certain. Was Estelle murdered, or had she been led into fulfilling her own prophecy? It was a question that neither logic nor reason could answer. Perhaps in the end, that was the true mystery, one that would never truly be solved. As the village disappeared behind the rolling hills, Miss Marple sat quietly in the carriage, her knitting resting forgotten in her lap. She had solved countless murders in her time, but this one stayed with her in a way the others had not. It wasn't the deception, nor the cruelty, that haunted her. She had seen worse. No, it was the lingering question that refused to be silenced, the one that gnawed at her mind. Had Estelle truly foreseen her own death, or had she been manipulated into believing it? Had the crime been perfectly calculated, or had something inexplicable slipped through the cracks of logic? The village faded into the distance, the cool afternoon air drifting in through the open window. For a moment Miss Marple closed her eyes, the hum of the carriage wheels the only sound in the stillness. Some mysteries, she mused, were never meant to be solved, and perhaps, just perhaps, that was the most unsettling thought of all.